to go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So, hello everyone. My name is Shanae Jones, and this is KNKY, which stands for Know the New Kinky You. First of all, let me just explain that if you see me looking here and looking there, it's just because I have multiple cameras going on, and I want to make sure that I give a little bit of eye contact to everything that's going on. So I am a certified sex coach, and what that means is that I work with couples and individuals who have questions about their sex life, things that they want to improve, questions that they want answered. And what we have to understand is that sex is one of the most natural things that we do, just like breathing. So it's not uncommon to want to have better quality and even better quantity of sex. So from an educational standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, everything that I do is to help people improve what it is that they do. So I'm going to help you at least understand tonight what it is that sex is even about. So we're talking about the science of sexual behavior and motivation. So I'll ask you a question. What is your biggest sex organ? I'll give you a second to think about it. If you say your penis or your vagina, the answer is wrong. Your biggest sex organ is your brain. So what we have to talk about is our brains are the meat of sexual behavior and motivation, as well as our vaginas and our penises. It is something that we use. It is something that manipulates how it is that we experience sex, and the specific part of our brain that controls this behavior is our hypothalamus. It plays a very important part in our motivated behavior. So, it wasn't really until the 1940s, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, where they started actually doing research on human sexuality. So everything we knew about sex to a certain point was based on animal research. So just quickly, some animal research showed that if there were lesions in a certain part of the hypothalamus called the medial preoptic, that lesion could impact our abilities to have sex, but not our abilities and our motivations to want to have sex. So it is believed that the motivation to want to have sex versus the physical ability to have sex are impacted by two different parts of the neurological system. So with that being said, if you use the examples of erectile dysfunction medications, people that use those medications, they desire sex, but they feel that they have a physical limitation to be able to allow them to have sex. So the research that has been done, this research specifically was on male rats, it shows that you have the ability to separate motivation from function. So just keep that in mind as we're thinking about why it is that certain things kind of happen to us. Now, human sexuality is way more complex than sexuality of rats or animals in general. So what we have to understand is that when we are talking about human sexuality, that there is a lot to still learn. But with these lessons that started in the 1940s with a man named Alfred Kinsey, who is the father of human sexuality research, he found that people just didn't know a lot about sex. They had it, they experienced it, but what they knew was just based off of their human sexuality, their personal experiences, and their experiences that was shared with their friends and the people that were in their lives, which is still common today. So think about the first time you had sex, or the first time you talked about sex. How did you know what to do, how to react, how to respond, how to give your partner your best, it's trial and error. It's still trial and error. But in the 1940s, they were really dumb. They just didn't know anything about sex. So Alfred Kinsey, a researcher, a scientist, a psychologist, started a study. Now, in this study, he basically went around the country and asked a whole lot of people, what do you know about sex? What do you do with sex? And the answers varied, right? So they varied to the point where certain things became outrageous, but other things became norm. They became, well, damn, I'm not the only person that likes oral sex. I'm not the only person that likes anal sex. I am not the only person that likes sex in public, or I'm not the only person that likes masturbating. I mean, back in the day, masturbation was something that was looked at as oh my God, I can't believe this is what you do. Masturbate? No. And I'll be honest with you, masturbation was not something that I was even comfortable with coming up as a young woman, because no one talked to me about it. No one told me that this was something that was natural, that is a process of learning your body. So I associated negative, or at least apprehensive, feelings towards masturbation. But come to find out from this study, a lot of people masturbate. Women masturbate, men masturbate, with toys, without toys, all kinds of things happen. But one of the things that the study showed was that the things that we thought were bad or harmful or taboo were really just things that we never talked about, and things that were more common than, needed to have happen. So let me give you a quick thing. Back in the day, long time ago, women especially, when we had sexual issues, the only people, it's men too, but the only people that we could talk to were doctors. And when we talked to doctors, they treat it as a medical condition. So what's interesting is that back in the day, when women had these sufferings, that they would go to the doctor, and the doctor would manually masturbate the clitoris to climax. You would go to the doctor to get a hand job, basically. And so what they found was that when you go to the doctor to get a hand job, it's not something that can happen in 5 minutes. It's not something that you can guarantee is going to work even. So, doctors started getting carpal tunnel. They're like, damn, this is taking a real long time. How am I going to be able to do this, right? So what they did was they moved on to water stimulation. So water stimulation of the clitoris made a mess in the doctor's office, and it was taking too long to clean up. It was too much to deal with. And so what they did was, and I hope you're following along and kind of guessing what it is that I'm about to say, but what it is that happened was that they eventually developed an electronic form of stimulating the clitoris. This is your first vibrator, and your first vibrator was done to relieve female hysteria. This is what they called it, right? So if you want more information on hysteria, female hysteria in particular, there is a movie that came out in 2011 called Hysteria. It is the story of the invention of the vibrator. Please feel free to go watch it. It is very interesting. All right, so when we're talking about the Kinsey research, he in 1947 developed an institute. It's the Kinsey Institute for Research Sex, Gender, Reproduction, at Indiana University. And again, it was established in 1947. Now, what Kinsey's work does, and what he is very important in human sexuality and the history of human sexuality, is that he was the first to do actual research that talked about human sexuality and what that meant to our lives, right? So again, he goes around the country, he asks a bunch of people about what it is that they do and what it is that they're interested in, and he published 2 books. The first book is Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and of course they focus on the male first, and that was put out in 1948. Now mind you, this is not current research, but this is the premise to how we got here today. And the second book is Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and that was put out in 1953. Now, the books were scientific in research, and what was interesting so much about these books is that the general public took to them like, oh my gosh, this is the next what are they called, the Star magazine, they just reality TV. They wanted to know more. They wanted to know about sex because nobody had ever talked about it before, except now you have Kinsey, who is out doing this research and trying to figure out what drives people, what motivates their sexuality, and what drives their behavior during sex. So the books themselves created the influence for future research, but there was a bit of a backlash when it came to Kinsey because, again, not all people are comfortable or happy talking about sex. I am a spirit who, just a few years ago, I've always been a very open person when it comes to sexuality and, you know, having conversations and expressing things, but having the motivation to get on social media and become a certified coach and want to help people have better sex lives is because I have learned the importance of sex in our lives, and when we don't have it, how detrimental it can be in other parts of our lives. So again, this is my motivation. This is why I'm talking to you today. This is why I hope that if you have concerns, questions, or anything that you want to talk about, that you'll send me a direct message and we can talk about it. We'll set up a coaching session. But again, this is why I do what I do, because there were people before me that were brave enough to do it. So all of the negative backlash that Kinsey got regarding his research, you know, people became more aware, but there again are those that were not comfortable with the research being published. They didn't want to talk about it. So he lost his grant funding. So he couldn't continue doing the research that he wanted to do. And you know, on the one hand, it's you're not alone. I realized that there of the 700 people, 700 in the 1940s. So, you know, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have a whole lot of mass communication. So they physically went out and talked to people and surveyed them and had these conversations about what was important. What did they like? Why did you like it? How did it turn you on? They had these conversations with these people, and they found that you were not alone. And people were validated. People were normalized because they figured out that they weren't the only people that were into what they were into. Things that, again, were taboo were now normal. So, in Kinsey studies during the 1940s and 50s, what you'll find is that women have just as much sex and interest in sex, are experiencing sex and have as much interest in sex as men do. Both men and women masturbate, and homosexuality is common. Homosexual acts are common. Now, again, this is not going to be applicable to everyone out there, but I want you to understand the concept. For a lot of people, sexuality is fluid. Kinsey came up with a scale, and the scale helps people define where they are in their sexual fluidity. There are some that believe that sex is not, your sexual orientation is not 100% straight and not 100% homosexual. So for instance, if I, as a heterosexual woman, look at another woman, I'm like, oh, she has a nice ass, or she has nice breasts. I'm recognizing her. There may be a slight attraction to her, but that doesn't mean I want to sleep with her. But that doesn't mean that because I find an attractive quality in her, then that takes my fluidity from 100% heterosexual to maybe 90% heterosexual because I found another woman attractive. Guys are less likely to admit this, but for those that are, you can see attractive qualities in another man, and that doesn't make you gay. It makes you somebody who can find attractive qualities in another man. So that being said, this is where the Kinsey scale kind of works for people. There is also, so it just takes you through the scale 1 through 6 or 0 through 6, where it's trying to help you figure out where you fall on your sexual orientation scale. It's out there still. If you're interested in taking it, go look it up. There is also another scale out there that I find interesting. There is the Klein scale, and the Klein scale does the same thing, but what it does is it imposes a time factor, saying that our sexual orientation is not only fluid, it's fluid based on the time period in our life. So we could be in a point where when we're young, we're very experimental, which we tend to be, right? And then as we are older and we are settled and we have gone through our experimental phase, I am now more comfortable in my sexuality. That could revert when you're older, because you could be like, fuck it, I am who I am and I'm going to do what I want to do. And this is not just for women, but this is for men as well. So sexuality being fluid is something that is becoming more and more popular. And it's because our brains are designed to find whatever we're interested in attractive. We're designed to pick up on those things that we find that chemistry with, those things that we are drawn to, and don't necessarily have a good reason for it except for the fact that we like it. And it can apply to anything in our life, not just sex, right? It can apply to food. Why is it that some people don't like mushrooms and I don't like oysters? I don't care. You can't put an oyster in front of me and me eat it. It's not going to happen. I don't care if you fry it, horseradish, hot sauce. I'm not eating it. I don't like it. I tried it. I don't like it. Other people, they can eat the whole tray of oysters, and it's all it's going to do is make me sick. Why? I don't know. It's usually a texture thing, but you know, why do we like what we like? Anyway, we'll move on. So if you're interested more about Kinsey, there is a 2004 movie called Kinsey. And just FYI, so you're not surprised and say I didn't tell you, unless it's a spoiler alert, but during the movie, Kinsey is a married man who finds himself in a bisexual relationship. So even he himself went on a path of discovery where he's married to a woman and ends up having an affair with a man. So I preface you by saying that, so you aren't gonna tell me that I didn't tell you it was there. It's there. All right, so the next pioneers that we're going to talk about, fast forward about 20 years, is William Masters and Virginia Johnson, who, when I tell you they stepped up their game in sex research, they stepped up their game. So Kinsey had about 700 people that he studied. No, Masters and Johnson, which is they're commonly referred to. So they published a book. And the book is dealing on the psychological responses of nearly, 10,000 sexual experiences, right? Of people who they're evaluating while they're having sex, but they're evaluating their physiological sense and their mental senses. So they observe these people having sex in different positions and masturbating manually or with a device. the researchers would measure blood pressure, respiration rate. They would also measure the sexual arousal, such as vaginal lubrication and penile swelling that happened with the erection. And they had a very good job, and I promise you that that's the job that I want one day. Let's see. The research that they did ended up giving us what we call today the sexual response cycle. And I've talked about the SRC in prior videos. So of course, if this is something that you're interested in hearing more of, please go back and watch the videos that I did specifically on SRC. But we're going to talk about it in brief today. So the SRC is, there are phases that we go through when we are experiencing sex. And what we have to understand is that the SRC is basically the same for men and women with a slight difference. So first phase is that excitement and arousal. So it's that build up. I like it. I want it. I want to do this. I'm in, right? You've kissed, you've hugged, you've touched, you've talked dirty, you have done all the things that you need to put yourself in a position to have sex. That is the first phase of our sexual response cycle. The plateau is when our bodies are starting to get that physical response for sex, where, you know, the man becomes erect, and you also see pre-cum. So that's their sign of they're in that plateau stage. And for us ladies, it's when our vaginas start to swell and we get an increase of blood flow to our labias, our labia minora. So, and again, if you don't know where your labia minora is, I have a video on that as well. Please go look at it. It has an anatomy. It's female anatomy. Go check that out. So after you go through plateau, I mean, you've gotten worked up, you're now being physical, and then you're ready to orgasm. You're ready to have that climax. That's the third phase of the SRC. So women will typically feel this rhythmic contraction within their pelvis and their uterus, and sometimes there's secretion, sometimes there's not. Orgasms are not always a part of sex. It is not guaranteed. There is a lot that goes into having an orgasm, and we've talked about this before as well. So if you're interested in the female orgasm, please go check out a prior video. I'm sure we'll talk about it again, but I have some stuff that's out there already. All right. With the men though, this is when your pelvic contractions start to go. Excuse me. And along with a buildup and a release of seminal fluid. So when you ejaculate, this is when you've reached your orgasmic state. And I personally also like to just recognize that although there is a physical release of potential fluid or a physical reaction during orgasm, it usually just feels like a release of this pent-up energy where it can come over your whole body. It's not designated to an area. And whenever asked the question, have you ever had an orgasm? If your answer is I don't know, the answer is no. When you have an orgasm, you know. So last phase of the SRC, resolution / refraction. So this is the period where it takes you time to recover in order to be able to have another orgasm. And this is the biggest difference between the SRC for men and the SRC for women. So the SRC for women, we typically go back and forth. So we can go from arousal to desire to orgasm, especially since women are more capable of having multiple orgasms, right? So we can have multiple orgasms and not go to our resolution stage. So go back, go forth, go back, go forth. Men typically, when you reach your orgasmic state, it takes a period of time called refraction for you to be able to build yourself back up in order to have an orgasm. Now, there was a gentleman I remember who challenged me a little bit on this, and I can come 5 times in a row. Perhaps your refractory stage is just that short, but it's not the same for all men. Some men take minutes, some men take hours, some men take days, which is why it is that we have to be mindful, especially in a relationship. If getting back to that phase takes a little longer, it just means we have to put in a little bit more work to make that happen. So understanding this sexual response cycle was all a result of this Masters and Johnson research, where again, they got to watch 10,000 sexual acts in order to understand the physiology and the psychology of how our body works and how it is that we respond to sexual cycles. Now, I will say that there are these two primarily, the Kinsey and the Masters and Johnson, are probably the most predominant. If you start to look up and research sexual history research, they're probably the most predominant. And I was not kidding when I say that at some point in the very near future, I'm going to start doing research on sexual history and sexual response, especially because, again, KNKY, if you don't know, I have a very strong interest in sex in the Black community. As a Black woman, it's where I'm most impactful. However, sex and sexual issues go across the board, across cultures, but there are some serious cultural differences in how it is that we experience sex. So we will be moving forward with trying to understand some of the more impactful things that happen that influence sexuality across cultures. But I'm going to start with the African American culture. So that wraps us up for tonight. I am Shanae Jones. This is KNKY, which stands for Know the New Kinky You. And just to give you a bit of a heads up of how things work, I do the Instagram live at 10 o'clock on Wednesdays. I'm going to do, because Instagram only keeps these stories for 24 hours, you will be able to find a repost of this live on YouTube within a couple of days at most. So if you have not subscribed to YouTube, please do so that you can either watch these in full, watch them again, and watch previous videos that I've done that perhaps you might find interesting or helpful. Again, I'm a certified sex coach, which means that my job, one of my jobs, is to help individuals and couples improve their sex lives. So if there are questions, concerns, or things you want to talk about, I offer a free consultation. So send me a direct message and I will give you the information on how we can schedule one of those. Everything I do across social media is DOYOUKNKY. So there's a Twitter, there is a YouTube, there is a Facebook, and of course we're on Instagram.